Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Decade News. I am Brittany Hayward, and today we are going to be talking about the 1980s. In this week's episode of Decade News, where we cover the 1980s, we are going to be looking at this book. It's called The Reagan Era, A History of the 1980s by Doug Rossinow. The points that we are going to be covering in this episode are 1. I'm going to present my own thesis of the 1980s. 2. I'm going to identify and critique Rossinow's thesis about the 1980s and his book, The Age of Reagan. 3. I'm going to tell you whether or not I buy his argument, what points I agree with, and what points I disagree with. Number 4, I'm going to tell you what I believe the major themes of the 1980s were. And number 5, we're going to be talking about the connections between the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. Since I was born towards the end of this decade, I was very unfamiliar with the issues that went on during this time. After reading The Reagan Era by Rossinow and watching many lectures and documentaries, I have come up with my own idea for the 1980s. And that is that the 1980s was a decade that was a continuation of the 1970s. Just like the 1970s was a continuation of the 1960s. However, through all of this research, I am realizing that all of the issues that are dealt with during each decade that carries over into the next decade, they are not the same. They sometimes change or evolve. This, for example, are issues such as civil rights and gay rights. In the 1970s, whenever we had an issue with civil rights, and we had a problem with African Americans not having the same rights as whites. And when we got into the 1980s, it became less of an issue whether or not they have rights or not. It was where do they belong in society? Obviously they belong in society, but people were still having discrimination when it came to hiring for work, and they were stuck in the working class when the employers were either forced to hire them or give them a chance so they can work their way up the scale, which before that was an issue because they weren't even able to even have the same rights to be able to work. And with the example of gay rights, in the 1970s, people were picketing and wanting to have rights as gay men and women when they weren't able to have the same rights as someone who was a heterosexual. However, in the 1980s, it evolved from having an issue of having the same rights as others into a situation where AIDS was prominent within the region and they were being discriminated against for having AIDS, and AIDS was looked at as a gay medical issue. And my last idea of the 1980s actually consists of the idea of foreign affairs. I believe this time was almost a revolution where Ronald Reagan set a standard for foreign affairs. Before this, people didn't really dabble as much with other countries as they are during this time. During the second Reagan administration, he had dealt with issues with Central America, the Middle East, terrorism and hijackings, the Iran-Contra corruption, and the USSR. And because of that, it started a trend that followed through to the 21st century and where we are today. In Rossinow's book, The Reagan Era, he believed that the 1980s was more than just a decade that Reagan reigned or was president. He believed that the 1980s was actually the legacy of Ronald Reagan. What I mean by this is that Ronald Reagan had a huge impact on the people nationally and internationally during this time. He began by trying to help the economy by cutting income tax for the rich because he did not believe in taxes. And this actually resulted in the conservatives taking over the Republican Party because they were in such a support of Reagan because he had very home traditional values. Rossinow also pointed out that within Reagan's legacy, he had a very aggressive foreign policy. In this book, The Reagan Era, there is a quote that I'm going to read right now. It says, on page 66, in 1980, in Ronald Reagan's mind, communism and terrorism were organically linked plagues of the age, and he had little time to lose in turning back this raging double-sided blight. American politicians had long referred to communists as terrorists, and Reagan declared a war on terror during his presidency. Like Carter, Reagan saw communism as an unnatural, immoral system that suppressed human desires for freedom that would eventually collapse. And since he hated communism so much, his goal was to try to get rid of it. Along with Reagan's aggressive foreign policy, he also believed in having strength through peace. And by that, he meant his relationship with Gorbachev, which he was the president of the Soviet Union at the time, and Reagan managed to befriend him on a larger scale than any other leader ever was able to befriend any other foreign officer. This peace that they were able to make due to this friendship made it so that Reagan and Gorbachev could break down walls and resolve issues a lot easier. When Rossinow said that the conservatives took over the Republican Party, he also meant that the conservatives were the biggest winners in the 1980s. Do I believe that fact? I don't know. It's kind of iffy in a way. As in, I can say that, oh, well, if you were rich, you won in a way because you were able to buy more things, and because at that time, buying showed status and luxury. So they could consider themselves winning, and that the people who were on the working side or the homeless lost. But in a sense, I don't really believe that. The reason I don't believe that is because the rich were able to show off their status by buying luxurious cars and houses. However, the working class had to prove themselves by keeping their families healthy and being able to feed themselves. And in the end, when all is said and done, due to the economy, they're the real winners because they were able to survive. Do I agree with Rossinow's idea that Reagan's legacy through strength and peace and his aggressive foreign policy benefited him? Yes, it was very beneficial. However, when it comes to the aggressive foreign policy, I do not 100% agree with Reagan's policy in the way that I would with George Bush's. Bush would go over there, and as soon as he was done dealing with whatever he was dealing with over there, he would immediately leave and not meddle. Reagan had a tendency to probably stay a little bit longer than he should have, and that caused him issues in the long run. This week, I have picked 5 main themes that I feel they are the most important to the 1980s. Number 1 would be civil rights. Number 2, I have actually picked 2 and joined them together. So there's the MTV movement and the drug use. And the reason I am putting them together, I will explain later. Number 3, foreign affairs. Number 4, the economy. And number 5 is the presidency of Ronald Reagan. The reason I picked civil rights is mainly because the fact that it was such an issue because it was overlooked. Because the government was not focusing on this, there was a split between the African Americans, and many fell either below or at the poverty line during the economic issues of this time. And also, like I previously said before, people were, or employers were forced to either hire some people who and were choosing to accept and bring African Americans up, into their business that would actually raise them and bring them up into the middle or upper class. And this was such an issue because since it wasn't focused on, people began to see them as different again. MTV was huge during this time. They had never seen anything like it. They had never seen music promoted like this ever before in their life. And this MTV movement and the dealings with drugs during this time shows how influential young people were during this time. Due to songs such as Born in the USA by Bruce Springsteen actually promoted activism in politics. Before, the young people weren't always keen on voting, but whenever they were exposed to this type of music and this type of promotion of music, they were more apt to vote and they felt like they were a part of something now. Like I said previously in my thesis, I believe that foreign affairs were very, very important during this time. And due to Reagan's aggressive foreign affairs, I believe that the future of foreign affairs was completely dependent on how active he was and how willing he was to actually go over there and form a friendship with someone who normally you might not always be able to have a relationship like that with. One of the main factors that affected this decade was the economy. Not just the fact that Ronald Reagan tried to help the economy by, getting rid of income tax and helping the rich out and the conservatives and the Republicans, but also it helped with status. People who had more money were able to afford more, and they were able to be able to high up there. The people who were unable to afford either were homeless or in the working class, and were considered, I wouldn't consider them losers, but Rossinow believes that they were the losing crowd. But it also had an effect on the split in African Americans in civil rights during this time, because, like I said, they had a hard time finding jobs because not everyone wanted to hire them. So I believe that the economy was one of the biggest influential issues of that time. One of the points that Rossinow makes is that he believes that the 1980s was full of something called Reaganism. And the reason I'm bringing this up now is because this is actually an important theme that I believe contributes to the 1980s. I believe that Ronald Reagan not only left his legacy in the 1980s because of his improvement on foreign policy and his improvement in the economy, but also in the attitudes of every citizen of the United States. He made it so everyone would feel like they could be confident in who they were, and he made it seem that everyone could feel at peace because he told them that everything was going to be all right. And that's why so many people liked him. One book I found that backs up Rossinow's idea of Reaganism is called Transforming America, Politics and Culture During the Reagan Years. And it says, it was by Robert M. Collins. And it says the revitalization of the U.S. economy did not solve all of the problems. However, Social Problems, Societal Issues discusses several of the vexing social ills that have afflicted American society in the 1980s. A seeming epidemic of homelessness, the discovery of an ominously large underclass of alienated, unemployed, and impoverished Americans in the nation's largest inner cities, a troubling rise in economic inequality in the society at large, and the emergence of AIDS, a new disease that struck hardest among the nation's male homosexual population. And I felt like I was reading Rossinow's book just by reading this introduction by Collins. And this is the reason why I picked this particular one, because they're almost identical, because although Rossinow focuses a lot on the economy, he focuses also on the societal problems at large. My second book that I found was called The America That Reagan Built by David Woodard. And this goes into saying that at the beginning of the decade, no one thought a political breakthrough by conservatives was possible. In one words of one commentator, the Republican Party stood for nothing and antagonized everybody. And then if you go down, it says the Reagan vision was different. He saw détente as pandering, tax increases as crippling, and liberalism as exhausted. Nowhere was the failed philosophy of the past more apparent than in the foreign policy. And the reason I picked this one is because it shows how the Republican Party and the conservatives was how they were viewed before Reagan decided to step up to president. And that was mentioned in the book we read, The Age of Reagan. And it kind of shows the transition from how it went from liberal to conservative, as he was saying. This last book I'm really excited about. It is called An American Life, and it's written by the one and only Ronald Reagan himself. And the point on this that I was looking up was I was trying to get his relationship with the president of the USSR, Gorbachev. And I went through, and even though I couldn't get an entire paragraph worth, there's little snippets of letters back and forth to him, and like how they are happy that this relationship can help them deal with like psychological barriers. So I'm going to go ahead and just read right now. All right, and it says, on page 646, in a Christmas Eve reply to my letter dated November 28th, Gorbachev said that he appreciated its personal and handwritten nature, that he was pleased at Geneva that we had managed to overcome a serious psychological barrier. And it says on page 15, as we walked up the hill towards the house where our advisors were still meeting, I told Gorbachev, you know, you've never seen the United States before, never been there. I think you would enjoy a visit to our country. And if you keep just going down here, you just keep going over and over on how close they were. And that was definitely pointed out in this book, but you can't really feel the friendship until you've actually read it for yourself. Like it says, Gorbachev sent me a letter that expressed his regrets and looked back on the journey the two of us have traveled together. And I can definitely see now that I've read all of these saying like how they're so happy that they actually have a friendship, and it makes making decisions as leaders a lot easier because they personally know each other. And that is why I am so excited to be able to read this firsthand. And like I said, like I never, with this book, I was like, okay, well, they're friends. I'm sure it's easier. But now to see, they were more than friends. They were best friends. And I'm just really excited that I was able to witness this book and see how this whole thing ended up playing out the way it did. And before we leave today, I am going to do a quick comparison between the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Back in the 60s and 70s, the economy was greatly dependent on consumerism. However, when we got to the 1980s, it actually changed and people were focusing more on finance markets savings and investing rather than actually buying as much. But at the same time, it still managed to raise their status. The 1980s was one of the first decades where the president was nominated at the very beginning and ended up staying almost all the way to the end. And that's why this particular decade is considered his legacy, because he pretty much had control of the entire thing, and he improved the foreign policy, which was completely different the last 2 decades, and a lot came out of that. Discrimination is still an issue that has carried over from the 1960s and the 1970s into the 1980s. However, at the very beginning, I said that they changed or evolved. So although the African Americans might not have the same issues with civil rights that they did in the 60s and 70s, it has evolved into something else in the 80s, which deals with being able to find jobs and be able to work their way up on the social status scale. Thanks again for joining us for this week's episode of Decade News and the 1980s. I really appreciate you listening in. So in the next 2 weeks, we'll be getting prepared to learn about the 1990s, and I can't wait to see you then. Have a good night.